Oh, I can turn yours. Microphone on.
There we go, how's that? All right, welcome. So we're continuing to talk about the reliability of the New Testament today. And so let's start with a word of prayer. Father, thank you for this time together. We thank you, Lord, for your word. We know that it is true, and I pray, Lord, as we look at the evidence, that we would see and know even with more confidence that the New Testament is true. It really is your word. We can trust it. We can live our lives by it. And in Jesus' name we thank you. Amen. All right, so just kind of continuing where we picking up where we left off from last week. So those that joined us on Zoom last week, we're looking at, here's a comparison. When I think I mentioned the amount of manuscripts that is, I don't know if I mentioned a number, but we did talk about manuscripts and what a manuscript is, the difference between a manuscript and an autograph. An autograph would have been the original document that was first written down, the original copy, in other words, and then the manuscripts were the copies of that came from the original autograph. And so we're going to see here the numbers. The New Testament has the most amount of manuscripts that we still have in existence than any other ancient source or any other ancient document. So you can see it there compared to things like, for example, Homer, who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, which essentially was the Greek version of the Bible, really, the Greek mythology, learning about the Trojan War, and then Odysseus and his journey home, and his 10-year journey back after the war. We only have about 1,800 manuscripts of that. Nobody really questions that Homer existed or that he lived, right? We have Demosthenes 200. Herodotus was a Greek historian, and historians consider him a credible source as a historian. And there's only 200 manuscripts, so how do we know 800 manuscripts, how do we know what he wrote? But see, nobody questions that. Tacitus, who we looked at, 20. Caesar, 7. Pliny, 7. So you can see, compared to the other ancient manuscripts, the New Testament blows that away with over 5,800 manuscripts. And yet that's the one that comes under the most attack and saying, well, that's not very reliable. We don't know what the New Testament originally said, and we just not. Well, the New Testament is the one that has the most early evidence that can show us what the original actually would have said. And why is it then that it still gets continually attacked? Well, remember, our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of spiritual darkness in the heavenly realms, right? So there's a spiritual battle. That's going to bring it to doubt. It's going to make people question the New Testament. And plus, anything that is the truth that's put forth in the world, there's going to be pushback from the enemy on that. And you can see that, when we're going to talk about postmodernism and stuff, and it's like, oh, whatever your truth is, that's good for you, man, but not Christianity, right? Like, then you're not allowed to have that. So you can tell Christianity is just the one that just always gets the attacks, and the New Testament is always under attack. But if we actually use our minds and think about this logically, you can see there is actually way more evidence for it than any other ancient source. Here's another thing, too. You go to the next slide. That we have the gaps between when the autograph was written and the earliest manuscripts. Okay, so here's the thing. The longer span of time you have from when a source was originally written down and to the earliest copy we have, obviously the longer that span of time, the more likely that it is to have some kind of corruption in the text take place in that time period. And what we see here is that the New Testament, again, blows everything else out of the water. So the earliest manuscripts that we likely have of the New Testament comes to within 25 years after it was originally written. That's not a lot of time. But you look at some of these other sources, you got 400 years, 1,400 years, 1,200 years, 1,000 years. Yeah, and these are things that people don't question. Alexander the Great, nobody questions that he existed. Nobody questions what he did. And yet, the earliest documentation that was actually written down about him, I'm not even talking about the earliest copy we have, I'm talking about written down, comes hundreds of years after his death. And yet nobody says, oh, well, that was written later. We don't know whether or not Alexander the Great was really a person or not, or whether he really conquered much of the known world. Nobody says that. But when it comes to the New Testament, oh, we can't rely on that. Well, here you can see that the earliest manuscripts come very, very, very early, and they're not too far removed from the time of the autographs. So, and I think there was one more on the last slide. There we go. Okay, Pliny is 750 years. He didn't fit on the other slide. Okay, so the next slide here asks the question, then why didn't God preserve the original? Why don't we still have the original copies? And I think some of you had some great insight last week already when you already said some of these things. So the two things are, if the originals existed, someone could change them. And so, whoever had control of that original autograph, that original copy, if they wanted to, they could smudge it, they could doctor it, and then they could say something totally different. But we can't do that because we have too many copies now, right? And we can compare to each other. So the multiple copies make that impossible. Okay? So if all of a sudden a group of manuscripts start being brought forward and saying, hey, look, these manuscripts say something different, we're going to say, well, sorry, because we have too many other copies elsewhere that are saying this. And that's going to outweigh what you're claiming over here. And so we can then reconstruct the original. So how that's done is, it's done through something called textual criticism, and I mentioned that last week. So you basically take all the manuscripts and you just compare them to each other. And if there was something that would say, the man traveled across the bridge, or then another manuscript said, the man walked across the bridge, or another one said, the man hopped across the bridge, or something like that. Hey, you have these differences in the different manuscripts. But what you do is you compare them all to each other, and then you figure out, it's kind of like piecing together a puzzle, you then can figure out what did the original actually say. And again, so any kind of difference, any textual variant is what they call a variance. And there are thousands of them, and we admit that. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of variants within the New Testament, which is a difference. But in a vast majority of those variants, they're very insignificant. In fact, something like one of the scribes, one of the monks who was, in the Middle Ages copying down a copy, he misspelled a word by accident. That counts as a variant. Or they might have switched the order of a word, or switch the order of the words in the sentence, which you can easily do in Greek and it still retains the meaning. Okay, doesn't change the meaning, but that counts as a variant, right? So in a small, very, very small minority of cases, does it actually affect the meaning of the text? Where it's like, okay, well, if the original said this, it would mean this, and if the original said that, it would mean that. So yes, we do have a couple of instances where that's true. But in no case does it have anything to do with any central core Christian doctrine. It's not saying in one hand, in one manuscript, Jesus is Lord and he's God, and another one saying, no, he's just a man that was a good teacher. Nothing like that at all. Or Jesus rose from the dead, or Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Today, you get a lot of pushback from, King James only people. They will point out things like, for example, if you look up some certain verses in the Bible, in the New Testament, off the top of my head, I can't think of any chapter, verse number, like what it would be, but there are a couple of some of the Gospels and some other places that you look up that verse and you actually notice that it skips a verse in the newer translations of the Bible. So we're talking NIV, ESV, NLT. There's like verse, it's just missing. It might go from verse 9 to verse 11. If you go to the King James, that verse will be in there. And so a lot of people are saying, ooh, see, people are playing with the Bible. They're taking things out. They're taking things out. And that's not accurate. That's not actually what's happening there. First off, what you have to keep in mind is that the Bible, of course, when it was written down, I think the writers of the Gospels or Paul, and it's not like they were writing and saying, okay, I'm writing this sentence and this is verse 1. Okay, now I'm going to go on to verse 2 and write this. No, nobody writes like that. Nobody writes with verse numbers and what they write. The chapters and verse numbers were not added until about the 1500s. So we're talking only about 500 years ago did we add chapter and verses to the Bible. Why? Well, because that helps us navigate the text a lot easier. So it's easier for me to say, turn to Mark chapter 2, verse 1, instead of saying, hey, let's go to that part of the Bible somewhere where Jesus heals that paralyzed man. Right? You'd be like, you'd be looking forever to try to find that, right? Because they did not write chapter numbers or verse numbers when they first wrote it down. So keep that in mind. So when the verse and chapter numbers were added, at that time what they were using as their manuscripts were much later manuscripts where some of the scribes, some of the people that copied the Bible took some liberties and did actually add some things into the Bible. They actually added a few words or phrases, maybe where they thought they needed to give a little commentary on it or give a little more explanation to what the text is saying. They kind of took liberty in just saying, we're going to just put that in there. And so when they translated that into the King James, the manuscripts they were using were those later manuscripts where those verses, well not verses, where those phrases, I should say, were added. Okay? And so then later when they added verse and chapter numbers, okay, that phrase, that sentence got a number to it, that got a verse number. Now we fast forward to modern day where we have found much more manuscripts from an earlier time, and so we're now translating from those, not these. Okay? And back here, it's just simply not there. Like those phrases aren't there. So, well, wait a minute. We already have a verse and chapter and verse system. What are we going to do? Well, instead of renumbering the whole thing and throwing everything off, we just skip that verse. We don't use that number. But it's not like something has been taken out. In fact, it was the opposite. The King James has verses in it that were added in later. I got into this debate one time with somebody who they wanted to come to the Duncannon Church of God, and they didn't like that we were not a King James only church. And so this woman was like, well, I'd like to come, but I have some problems with that. And so she pointed out a lot of verses where, I think Colossians has a verse where it talks about that we're redeemed by the blood. It says in the King James, by his blood. And if you look at the NIV or any other modern translations, it doesn't say by blood, by his blood. So she had a problem with that. See, she's saying, see, they're taking it out. They're negating the fact that we're redeemed by the blood of Jesus. So the important thing is we got to look into the original source. What did the original source say? So I went back to the Greek, and I used the Greek New Testament that I had at home. Used Logos Bible software, I think it was, and went in, and that phrase, by his blood, wasn't there. So what I did notice, though, was that there's a very similar verse in Ephesians, and it does say, by his blood. Plus, I went through the New Testament, and I compiled a list of all the other places where in the original Greek it does say that we're redeemed by Jesus' blood. And so I pointed out to her, I said, hey, look, just because it's missing in this one place, there's still, look at all the other examples in the New Testament where it does still say that. I said, probably what happened is, when they were copying down Colossians, they said, hey, this is a similar verse to over here in Ephesians where it says by his blood. Let's just clarify and also put that in here. So, again, that's not what's going on. So when you hear people try to say, oh, the Bible's been corrupted, and you can only use the King James, and that's just not true, okay? That's just it's just completely bogus. And so why torture yourself and use a King James Bible? That's an English Bible that dates back to 400 years ago. Like, that's ridiculous. Okay. Okay. So I wanted to do a little activity today that I thought we would have did last week. So we're going to play a telephone game. Has anybody ever played the telephone game? Okay. So we're going to do it a little bit different because we're going to do it in 2 phases. So I'll go in the back. We'll go out in the vestibule there. And if one of you would come back, I'll tell you the phrase, and then we're just going to do it like normal. You're just going to have someone else will go back that person will repeat the phrase to them, and then they'll do it on down the line till we have everybody has heard it. And we'll see how corrupted it gets. And this usually gets can get very goofy. This might be a little bit different because there's not as many of you as there is. I do this at school, and there's a whole classroom full of students, and so it has more chance to get corrupted. Plus, you know how students can be; they can be really silly. So yeah. So some of the some of the results we got when I did this in the classroom were really ridiculous. But we'll see how it goes. There's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's only 8 of you. So yeah, I did have one small class. There was like 8, and I think it was perfect. But we'll still try it. But once you get 20, 25 students, then okay, you know, that's when it starts to get messed up. But we're going to do it that way, and then we're going to switch it up. We're going to do the telephone meeting in a little bit of a different way because I want to show you basically how the New Testament was transmitted down to us, how it was, and also how it was not, and how people claim that it was, but it's not true. So, who wants to come back first? Tracy, would you want to come back first? And then we'll just go up the rows and then over to here until everybody has the phrase, okay? Now, I'm only going to repeat it once, or not repeat, I'm only going to say it once. Okay, that's one of the rules, and so you can only say it one time. And if the person didn't quite hear what you said, they're going to have to go with what they thought that they said, okay? So let's go ahead. We'll begin. I guess I should turn my mic off, huh? Okay. I was like, you don't want to hear what I'm saying.
Are they gonna each come back to me?
Yeah, then I'll
Okay.
come out to you and then you can come back.
Okay, you ready for this? Okay, who's next?
You said tiny toads?
Yeah.
2 tinies, okay. And you said fast flying flies? Yeah, so the original was actually tiny toads ate fat flying flies. So even with 8 people, you see how it starts to get corrupted now if you keep going down the line. You see, this is where critics will say, aha, see? You know, the New Testament just keeps getting, it's a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. And so how do we know that the New Testament that we have today is really what the original authors wrote? Well, if that's how the New Testament was disseminated, then yeah, you could say that. That's not how the New Testament was disseminated, though. So we're going to do something different. We're going to try a different version of the telephone game here. So would somebody want to be my point person? Tracy, would you be okay doing that? So in this case, Tracy, you're going to have to stay out there, and everybody's going to come to you. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to go out just for a second here, and when I go out, I can turn my mic off, and then I'm going to tell her what the phrase is, and then one by one, each of you are going to go to receive the message from Tracy. Okay? So. All right. Can we go first?
Okay.
I think I got it.
Yes.
I guess I could have done it first. Read, but at school I can't. I wouldn't be able to go out in the hallway
Right.
the whole time. I can trust you guys not to misbehave, right?
Do you do this a lot in class, or is it just like once?
Once a year, well, it's now once every other year because I only do this course every other year. So I did it this year. I did it back in September, October, whenever I covered this in class. Yeah. And it got really ridiculous, and some of it got borderline inappropriate. Some of the results that they came up with, but still illustrated my point. So, all right. So I think we've all got That was exactly what this says. So you see the difference. What was the difference? Like in the way that that information was distributed. Yeah, direct from the source. Tracy was the source. She would represent the autograph. All of you would represent your copies of that, you're the manuscripts. And so it's not passed down from manuscript to manuscript to manuscript. It's actually, you have the source which branches off, and all the copies get their source right from here. And when you do it that way, you can see it maintains its accuracy. That's how the New Testament was disseminated. And it was spread all throughout the Roman world. You might find that you have some separate streams of dissemination, right? Some different groupings of manuscripts so that you can see, okay, these seem to be related to one another. They might have a common source. These seem to be related to each other. They have a common source. But you have to keep in mind that they all go back to the original source. So it's not like one at a time down one manuscript to another. Because if that was the case, then yes, you would have reason to question what the New Testament actually says. But that's not how it was disseminated. All right, so hopefully that illustrated that point for you. Now, looking at, these are some of the stats that are, if you go to the next slide, that I mentioned already, but here's a little bit more detail about them, okay? So it actually gives you some numbers. So I talked about the errors, or what they call variants. And variants could be an error, or I guess they could be more deliberate, where something is, a word or a phrase added, or order of words are changed. And so we say that there are 200,000 variants in the New Testament, okay? So at first that sounds like a lot. That sounds like, whoa, okay. So you mean there's like a difference of like 200,000 in there? Well, like I mentioned before, a majority of them are just grammatical or spelling errors, okay? And so if it's a grammatical or spelling error, obviously we can figure that out, right? We know how the Greek word was spelled. We know what word they're trying to spell. We can figure out which word it was. It's not a big deal, right? Or if it's a grammatical thing. So we can figure that out. Some people are better than that than others. Like, I cannot read elementary students' work. Carrie knows how to do that. I can't do that. I've tried doing that. I have no idea what they're trying to say. But anyway, one misspelling in one word would count as 2,000 copies. No, sorry, one misspelling in one word in 2,000 copies counts as 2,000 errors or variants, right? So, okay, so if you look at 2,000 of the copies and 2,000 of them, which by the way is not even half of all the manuscripts that we have, if there's just an error in that, that counts as not one but 2,000 errors or 2,000 variants, right? So there you go, you have 2,000 right there, just by one variant in a text. So you see how quickly that can multiply. But the New Testament manuscripts still do have a 99.5% accuracy. So we know within 99.5% of the New Testament, we know for sure what it actually originally said. That's pretty good. 99.5. Not like, oh, we only know about half of it. I don't know if you guys ever heard of the Jesus Seminar that was back in the 1970s, and this group of scholars, I'll say, got together, and they want to get together to decide what Jesus actually said and what he didn't say, or we don't know, and they actually voted by different colored beads. They would say, oh, well, we know he said this, or well, we're not sure, or we know he definitely didn't say that, right? And it was very arbitrary. It was very subjective. There was no scholarly work done on this. And for example, they took the Lord's Prayer, and the only thing that they know for sure, according to this study, that Jesus actually said was in the Lord's Prayer was, "Our Father." That's it. They said, the rest of it we don't know if he said that, or some of it we know he didn't. Like, where do you come off with this stuff? That's just bogus. Don't listen to that kind of stuff. That's ridiculous. Like, any scholar would just laugh at that and say that's just there was no like intellectual effort put into that. They're just like, it was very subjective. Like, I don't think he would have said that. That doesn't sound like he would have said that. I vote he didn't say that. Okay, that's just ridiculous. Now, out of the 200,000 variants, there are 400 variants that do affect the meaning. Now remember, that doesn't mean there's 400 different places throughout the New Testament where we don't know. It just means that, remember, if there's one difference in 400 of the copies, then that counts as 400 variants, right? So there might be only one place or a few places. I think it's only like really 2 or 3 places in the New Testament where we're like, we really don't know what that said, or we really don't know the meaning of that. And so therefore we really don't know how to interpret that. And so if you really have done some study of the Bible really extensively, you will have come across some of those that you're like, yeah, I don't know what to do with that. And that's okay. And because those are things that, again, they don't affect essential core biblical doctrine. Okay? So we don't have to guess whether or not there's a Holy Spirit, that there's a Trinity, that there was a resurrection, or that Jesus was divine, or that our sins are forgiven through Jesus' blood. We don't have to doubt those things because in no case are those under question at all. Okay? So, I'm going to skip ahead so let's skip ahead to the next section here a second. And I want to see if I have a video to show you guys. Okay, the next section here is called Reliability of the Gospels. We're the eyewitnesses telling the truth. Okay, so we know the documents are accurate. Hopefully, by what I talked about here the last couple of weeks so far, you get the idea that, okay, we can trust that what we have today, it has been preserved for us. That it is what, within 99.5% accuracy, it is what the original authors did write down. And of course, it's been translated to English, but we know what it said. And if you look at the Greek, we know what it said. But now the other question comes up, though, is, okay, but were the eyewitnesses, or those that wrote down the New Testament, were they telling the truth? Because, couldn't they just have made it up? Right? And then the whole world is duped because they think that this really happened, that Jesus really was a person, that he really rose from the dead, that he really is God. And it's really just a bunch of guys that got together and said, let's make this up. Well, first up, I want to show you a video clip, and if it doesn't work through the PowerPoint, maybe you can look it up or something. Let's see if it works. It's called The Disciples' Epic Prank by Babylon Bee. So let's see if it works. This is hilarious. And I think it'll prove the point. It's very satirical.
I need 100% participation for this to work. Yeah, everyone's here. All 12, 11. 11 of us. Well, what's the plan?
Well, as you know, Jesus is dead.
But stick with me, okay? Stick with me. I have a plan.
We are going to steal his body,
Okay, I'm tracking with you. What's next?
and then we're going to tell the whole world that he rose from the dead.
Oh, you know I'm in.
I love it already.
All right, classic. Then what?
And then we're all going to get brutally murdered.
Wait, come again. Could you go over that last part real quick?
Oh, what? We get murdered. What's the problem?
I like it. I like it. Hey, don't get me wrong, Pete. I love me a good hoax as much as the next guy, right? What's in it for us? Do we all get riches, fame, and fortune first, right?
No, get this. You're going to be hated, persecuted, and reviled for the rest of your life.
I mean, why on earth would we do this? Can we start over?
Okay, we'll start from the beginning. Everybody, for John, beloved disciple.
So, okay. We go down to Jesus' tomb.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Then we pay off the Roman soldiers that are guarding the tomb with their lives.
Why would they do that?
And we
Somehow roll away the big stone that's in front of the tomb. Obviously, you have to move the rock first.
Yeah.
then we steal his body.
Yeah, I mean, I guess.
Then we tell the whole world that he rose from the dead, and we get brutally murdered from thrones.
Okay, guys, and then what?
Then we all get killed. Come on.
When do we see ourselves become exalted and praised?
That's just it. You don't.
What is happening? Anyone hear what I'm saying? This is the most idiotic plan of all time.
Chill out, bro. Do I really have to explain the joke to you? Look, it's that we lie about Jesus' resurrection, and then we all die.
Okay, look, back me up here. I know you can't be cool with all this. I know you're gonna have some doubts. Come on.
Doubts? Oh no, how many doubts?
Okay, you guys have officially lost it, okay? I'm out of here. I'd rather be exiled to a deserted island than spend another minute with you wackos.
And I got some good news for you.
All right. So, I think that's pretty funny. So, I don't know if you guys caught what the point is they're making, because here's what the critics often say about the New Testament. They say, oh, they just made it all up so they could get power, wealth, and whatever their hearts desired, right? And what this is pointing out is, and Babylon Bee is they're a satirical website, social media platform that is very, well, sometimes I think they go a little too far, and sometimes they're a little un-Christ-like. But they do what's called satire, and satire is basically comedy that goes to prove or to make a point. And they're here, the way you see, they're showing how absurd that idea would be for them to actually lie about Jesus' death and resurrection. Because what did they get for it? Well, they got persecuted, they got thrown in prison, and they got killed. All of the disciples, except for John, were killed, which is why they reference about the deserted island at the end of the disciple John was saying about. And so it just goes to show how ridiculous, how absurd that would be. And so some people might say, oh, well, of course a lot of people are willing to die for what they believe. Like, look at the terrorists in 9/11. They were willing to fly those planes into the building because they believed that if they would do that, and they would die in the struggle, in the struggle of jihad, that they would go directly to heaven and have eternal reward. Yeah, but there's a difference. Because with the disciples, they were supposedly had been eyewitnesses to these events that they were claiming were true. So they were in the position to know whether or not what they were claiming was true or not. Those terrorists and the terrorist attacks were not in a position to know whether or not what they believed was actually really true. The difference is the source of this new idea was coming from these disciples. And so if you were going to start a new religion or a new movement, and you're going to do it for yourself, to gain power for yourself, and then in the efforts you actually found that you were getting a lot of pushback and persecution and the threat of imprisonment or death, I think that we would all say, you know what, it's not worth it. I'll just come clean and say, hey, you know what, I'm making the whole thing up. But the difference is they never once said, yeah, you know what, we made it up. They stuck to it because they really believed that what they had seen was really real, was really true. Because they were in a position to know whether it was or not it was really true. They were eyewitnesses. And so hopefully that helps you to see how we can easily refute what the critics would say about that. So the next slide asks the question, can the biographies of Jesus be trusted? Okay, so number one, the biographies of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written by either eyewitnesses or somebody who was an indirect eyewitness to the events of Jesus' life. So, for example, Matthew and John were written by they were both Jesus' disciples, so they were followers of Jesus for 3 years. They heard what he said, they listened, they took in his teaching, they saw what he did, they witnessed the miracles, they witnessed him being arrested, they witnessed his resurrection, so they were direct eyewitnesses to these events that are recorded in the Gospels. And in the case of Mark and Luke, you have, so they weren't really there for all those events, but they were indirect eyewitnesses because they knew some of those who were eyewitnesses to the events of Jesus' life. And so, John Mark would have been able to talk to some of the disciples. Luke, the same thing. He was actually a Gentile physician. They had access to them. They lived at the same time as the apostles, so they could actually get that information from them and write it down. So it's not like these were written much later. It's not like they became legend. They were either by direct or indirect witnesses. Too early to be explained as legend, like I said, number two. And number three, the early church believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. I think I mentioned that before with the 1 Corinthians 15 creed last week. We talked about how that was an early creed that dates within about 6 months of the resurrection. And so there are a lot of critics out there that will try to throw that at you and say, hey, this idea of Jesus being God and him raising from the dead, that was something that was fabricated much, much later, hundreds of years later, or maybe the Catholic Church just made that up in order to control people or something like that. Okay, well, you can easily refute that because even atheistic New Testament scholars, who are not Christians, by the way, even they admit that the early church, within the first year after Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, they already believed that he was God. They already believed that he rose from the dead, and that's not refutable. In fact, most historians, and I'm not talking about Christian historians, I'm talking about non-Christian historians. Most Christian historians all will admit and agree that the tomb of Jesus was empty. Like, that is an historical fact. Now, they'll differ on the interpretation of why it was empty, okay? And we'll talk about some of those theories, and we'll refute those probably next week. But yeah, most historians agree that there really was a man named Jesus. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He was placed in a newly created tomb, and that tomb was found to be empty. Okay? That is historical fact. The discrepancy comes in with, okay, well, why was the tomb empty? And so a lot of theories, was his body stolen, or what happened? Was it the wrong tomb? Did they place his body in a different tomb? So we'll talk about those next week, and we'll refute each of those theories. But at least you can know that even non-Christians agree that the tomb was empty. Also, the authors, number 4, were honest and willing to include difficult to explain material. So I think a little bit of that was alluded to in this video we just watched. Thomas in this video said something about like doubts. I will never have any doubts, right? But in the New Testament, in the Gospel of John, we see it talks about Thomas and having doubts, and also Peter and how Peter messes up. Peter, he says, "I'll never deny you, Lord," and he denies him 3 times. And so there's a lot of instances. Also Peter gets called Satan by Jesus, and he says, "Don't be a stumbling block to me," because Peter's saying, "No, surely you will not be handed over." So if this is really something that these apostles were making up, they were fabricating this, then they would want to portray themselves in a positive light, right? Not gonna say, "Oh yeah, I doubted," or I was insecure, or I didn't know. No, they're gonna say, "Yes, I was sure the whole way," right? Like, that's how we would want to portray ourselves. But obviously, they were very open and honest, and reported exactly what happened as it happened, and just let the chips fall where they will. Okay. Moving on to number 5 on the next slide. There is harmony on essential facts and diverging in details. it lends to historical credibility to the accounts. So if you notice when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, especially if you're going to sit down and over a short period of time just read right through them, you will immediately start to notice some of the differences in the details. And that can bring into a lot of question. Okay, well, why are they different? And so, for example, when they went to the tomb, when the disciples and the women went to the tomb, when the women went there, were there two angels or were there one? Was the angel inside the tomb or was the angel sitting on top of the stone that was rolled away? All right, so there's all these differences in details. That's just one of the examples. Another big one that is sometimes difficult to explain is Jesus when he casts the demons out of the man and cast them into the pigs, and the pigs go over the cliff into the Sea of Galilee. How many men did Jesus drive demons out of? Was it one or was it two? Well, depending on which gospel you read, most gospels say, I think it's only in the three synoptic gospels, so two of them say it was one man, and one of them says it was actually two. Which one was it? Was it one or two? Well, here's the thing, wherever there are two, there is always at least one, right? So it might depend on your point of view, your perspective. These are all perspective things. We are running out of time here, so next week we're going to do an activity where we're going to, hopefully this will work, I don't know, we'll try it, where you guys are going to try to take in some visual information and see what you notice and see if there is any difference in what you notice, because we're all going to notice different things. And when you are an eyewitness to an event, you will notice different things. So, for example, J. Warner Wallace, who was he used to be a homicide detective. He was an atheist, but he later became a Christian, and now he wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity and some other books. He's a great Christian apologist. He has a podcast as well. I think I might have mentioned that or put that on the list of resources and podcasts and things. One of the things that he would want to do is whenever he was talking to witnesses of a crime, the first thing he would want to do is separate them. Now, the reason why he'd want to separate them is because if they are together and talking about what they saw, some of what they've seen could bleed over into each other's stories. Also, they could collude together and make up a story together, get their facts straight, say, let's get together, let's decide how this story went, how it went down, right? No, he wants them separated so he can get the individual eyewitness accounts, and that he can get all the different pieces from all the different perspectives, and then you can piece them together. And I think he used one example in his book where it was someone that got robbed or something in a convenience store, and there was like a woman that witnessed it. She's like, yeah, he had a certain kind of brand of shirt with a little logo right here, it's this, that, and the other thing, but he didn't have a gun. And there was a man that witnessed, and he's like, oh, I don't know what kind of shirt he had on, but he had this kind of gun, and this, and had this and that, and all that kind of features on it, things like that. And he said there definitely was a gun. So what was it? Was there a gun or wasn't there a gun? Well, it's probably because he noticed they would notice different things, right? She was more into noticing what kind of shirt is he wearing. The man was like, okay, I'm noticing like the gun, right? And so you piece it together and you see you can get a whole picture. All right. So just because there's actually differences among the Gospels in some of those details, J. Warner Wallace, who was an atheist and came to Christ, actually used the same methods he does in detective work. He applied that to the Bible, and he actually realized, hey, the fact that that there is divergence in details actually fits. It gives it credibility because he said, that's what I see in when I do cold case or when I do when I'm talking to people that witnessed a crime. He said that's what I want to see. I want to see divergence in details. I want to see differences because that gives more credibility to the story. If everyone's telling the same exact story, he said that's suspect. And so it could be that God, that's one of the reasons why there are 4 accounts of Jesus' life and death and resurrection, as opposed to many other parts of the Bible. There's only one account of things, right? But in the case of Jesus, there's 4 because we want to I think God wants us to have a more broad, clearer picture of who Jesus is, what he did, why he came, and what that means for us. So that's where we'll stop here for this week. Hopefully this has is really reliable and we can trust it.